Vær med og støtt dette viktige arbeidet. Gi en gave på Vips nummer 10466, eller enda bedre, bli en partner ved å gå inn på skaperkraft.no. Tusen takk for din gave.
Great listening to you, Rod. Thank you for coming. I just thought, starting with a question that I grew up, in the Protestant Lutheran church, and for us, beauty was more of an optional, a bonus. In your book, you have a whole chapter about it's so essential to understand God and to have a fully human life. Can you explain why?
Sure. Well, I grew up in small town South Louisiana in America. My parents were Methodist, but we only went to church on Easter and Christmas, so I didn't have much of a religious formation. By the time I got to be a teenager, I was an agnostic and maybe an atheist. I thought Christianity was nonsense. And then my mother won a trip to Europe in a contest. She didn't want to go, so I was the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists going across Europe. I didn't care. I was going to Paris, my favorite city. On the way to Paris, the bus stopped to see an old church. I'm like, another old church. But I got off the bus and followed the old people in, and I met God. This was the cathedral at Chartres, which I knew nothing about growing up in late 20th century America. I stood there in that cathedral and looked around, and I was just overwhelmed by the presence of God. And I somehow knew that God was real. All of my very shallow teenage objections to Christianity vanished. And I had the thought, I want to know the God that inspired men whose names we have lost in history 800 years ago, that inspired them to build such a glorious temple to worship him in. Now, I didn't walk out of there as a reconverted Christian or as a converted Christian, but I did walk out of there on a search. And it was started by beauty, by the overwhelming power of God's awesomeness in beauty. The religion scholar Mircea Eliade says that we in the modern world have a very shallow idea of God compared to the ancients and primitive cultures. They believe in God, the old cultures do, as having this massive, overwhelming power. And that's what I felt in Chartres. I had an illumination there. And it took me a long time, but I finally ended up surrendering my life to Christ. But it started with my heart being struck by beauty. Now, I believe that beauty is always a sign, true beauty is a sign that points us to God and asserts his presence. One of my favorite films is a Russian film called Andrei Rublev, made by Andrei Tarkovsky in 1966. There's a scene in the middle of the film, it's set in medieval Russia, where Andrei, he's an iconographer, he's just lived through the sacking of a cathedral by the barbarians. And he's sobbing in the ruins of the cathedral. All of his artwork has been destroyed. And then the ghost of his mentor, who had taught him how to be an iconographer, appears to him to try to tell him, don't lose hope. And what the mentor tells him is, you will always have suffering and evil in this world, but God has given you the gift of creating beauty. And this beauty will help the people who are suffering through all this evil and chaos remember that there is another world, that this evil and suffering is not all there is, and you need to accept that responsibility. And eventually, by the end of the film, he does. So that's why I think beauty is so important. We can begin with our love of beauty and follow that to discovering God and learning to love God. This is exactly what happened to Dante in the Divine Comedy. The character Dante, he starts out the poem lost, but he begins to follow the beauty of Beatrice, the woman he loved in this life, who had died. But Beatrice tells him eventually, don't look at my beauty. Everything that is beautiful in me comes from God. Look to God. By the end of his journey, Dante is able to go back to this world of great suffering and fighting and turmoil in Italy and see everything impregnated with meaning because of beauty.
Wow, thank you. Many people, they long for re-enchantment, like you said. There's a lot of young people searching for it. But there's also a fear of, we don't want to go back to superstition, anti-intellectualism. How can we recover this wonder and transcendence without losing the gains of modernity? How can we can't just go back, to 500 years. How do we mix this?
Yeah, I think it's a false choice. And this is something I hear from people all the time. They say, well, do you think we should go back to before we had indoor plumbing? And I say no. And I say no because of something that happened to me in Norway when I was last here 30 years ago. In January, I was at a cabin out in the woods and had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and it was an outhouse. I had to walk through snow this whole. But no, we can't go back to an earlier age, and we should be grateful for all the gifts that that modernity has given us, medicine, all kinds of things that have helped us have better lives. But I think it's a false choice to say that we have to do either or. I know scientists who are very faithful Christians, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, and they don't see a contradiction there. Now, it is true that to be enchanted in the sense that I talked about, you have to be willing to give up the purely materialistic worldview. But then again, if you're a real Christian, you've already made that choice. And I think that for us, it's a matter of ordering our priorities and ordering our epistemology, that is the way we see the world, not to deny the intellect, but to give the intellect its proper place. When I converted to Christianity in my mid-20s, I became a Catholic. And I was a very proud Catholic. A Christian shouldn't be proud, but I was very prideful. That's not the Catholic Church's fault. That was me. But I was such an intellectual Catholic, and I figured that as long as I had all of the arguments for the faith clear in my head, that nothing could touch my faith. A few years go by, and then as a journalist in New York City, I started to write about the sexual abuse scandal. And it was horrifying, hellish, the things I learned. But I kept telling myself the sins of the priest do not negate the truths the church proclaims. And I still believe that. What I didn't understand, though, was that you can get to a place where the horrors that you see are so great that you can't even take the argument seriously. For me, after 4 years of writing about the scandal and trying to hold on to my Catholic faith, it was like trying to hold an iron skillet over a fire with your bare hand. I finally had to let it go. But by God's grace and his mercy, he led me to orthodoxy, which is a way of being Christian that is very intellectually deep, but it insists that the conversion of the heart is the most important thing. I remember asking the priest when I first started getting interested in orthodoxy, what should I read? He said, well, there are lots of books you can read, but the most important thing is to come to church and pray and keep praying and fast. You have to have your heart converted and the mind will follow. And I think that's the model that we should follow today.
Good. In your book also, you write quite a bit about signs, wonders. I grew up, in a world where, we had at least many charismatic friends and we saw some wild stuff. But when I read about the saints in the Orthodox Church, you believe in crazy stories. And for many, that's the stumbling block in the Bible. They think, I love Jesus, his teaching, he loves the poor, but this miracle stuff. Why is it important for you to tell these stories about the supernatural?
Because they really do happen. I start out my book, Living in Wonder, with a story about a junkie, a former junkie from London named Ian. I met him in Jerusalem. I was in Jerusalem on Holy Week 4 years ago. And I went into a shop, and there was this really grumpy-looking Englishman at the back of the shop. And I started talking to him, and he turned out to be so full of joy. He just looked tough because he was a working-class Londoner. And I said, and he had a very thick working-class London accent. I said, what brought you to Jerusalem? He said, I was looking for drugs. And he talked about how he had been addicted to heroin in London, and he ended up in Tel Aviv because he heard the heroin was better there. And it was, but he realized he was going to die if he kept up. He went to rehab twice and failed out. Something told him, you have no more chances left. If you don't kick this habit, you're going to die. He decided, for some reason, to walk from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River. And he had no background in Christianity, knew nothing about it. On his walk there, where he was going to sit there until he either died from the withdrawal symptoms or the heroin habit left him. On his way, somebody gave him a copy of the New Testament. He told me that he sat down on the bank of the river and began to read. And when he got to the part where Jesus was baptized, he noticed on the other bank of the river, a cloud was forming at the level of the ground. And he said, that's really strange. The cloud began to move across the river towards him. As it got closer to him, it got thicker and thicker and thicker. Finally, it was all around him. It was surrounding him. He told me that inside that cloud, he felt the purest love. He didn't know love like that could exist. He said he was in heaven, and he didn't know how long it lasted, but he felt so cleansed and so loved, and he felt like he had worth for the first time in his life. When the cloud disappeared, 4 days had gone by, and he was clean. He had no desire for heroin. He went back to Jerusalem. He had no money. He was hungry. He begged for money. An evangelical pastor said, come to our mission, brother. We'll give you a shower and something to eat. He did that, and then later he was baptized. And he gave me his testimony right there in a shop in Jerusalem. And it's like in the first chapter of my book. Now, why is that story important? Because it shows us that these things happen today. They're not just from the days of the Bible. They're happening today. Tomorrow, people here will hear from Father Carlos Martins, who's a friend of mine and an exorcist. And let me tell you, I have friends who are exorcists. My spiritual father is an Orthodox exorcist. You spend time with these people, and you know that the spiritual world is very real. I think, though, that miracle stories are important because they do remind us that there is more to life than what we can see. I tell a story in my book, Living in Wonder, about a friend in New York whose wife was possessed, and she was even examined by a psychiatrist, and who said, we can't explain what's happening to her through any natural means. And she was finally delivered by an exorcism. But I remember walking through New York City from his apartment on the Upper East Side, which is a very fancy part of New York. Now, these are not primitive people. He was a stockbroker, right? And I said, how has all of this experience changed you? He said, now I realize when I'm walking through New York City, all around me, there's a great spiritual battle going on. We just can't see it. That's why these stories are important.
But for people who are skeptical, thinking, how do we know this is true? A lot of people like attention, like to make up things. How do you separate what to believe in and what's false?
Well, skepticism is important. I mean, not everybody is telling the truth, but I think you should look at the lives of the people and how they were changed, people who claim to have experienced miracles. The thing, I told you that I got started on my spiritual path to Christ by the experience of wonder in the Chartres Cathedral. The thing that finally made me decide, yes, I'm going to give my life to Jesus, it came when I was a young journalist in my first job in Louisiana. I was sent to interview an elderly Catholic priest who had been born in the 1890s. He was almost 100 years old. Before he became a priest in midlife, he was an artist and an art professor. And my editor wanted me to find out about his life as an artist. So I went to see Monsignor Sanchez. He opened the door, and it was like Yoda, right? He was a short little guy, but he was just glowing with peace and invited me in, and I asked his life story. I won't tell the whole long story here, but he had been born in Guatemala in the 1890s, went for his education in America, lost his faith, but later in life experienced two radical miracles. The first one brought him back to belief in God, and the second one brought him to the priesthood. As this old man was telling me these stories of things that had happened 50 and 60 years ago, he was sobbing. And I knew I was listening to a witness. I knew that it had really happened to this man because he changed his life after this experience. And that made me leave his apartment saying, I can't hide anymore. I've got to give my life to Christ. And so the proof to me that his story was real was how he reacted to it. There's another interesting story I tell in the book about an American author, a novelist named Tobias Wolff, who experienced a miracle. His sight was restored when he was at Lourdes in France in the 1970s as a volunteer. And when he had his vision given back to him, he felt this overwhelming inner urge to just go to the grotto at Lourdes and pray. Just say thank you. Just thank God for this. But he didn't do it. The next morning, he woke up and his vision was very poor again. Reflecting on this many years later, he said, of course I wanted to be able to see with clarity. But the thing is, I didn't want to make a sacrifice. I didn't want to change my life. And if accepting the miracle meant I had to change my life, then I didn't want to do it. This is always a possibility for us, you know? And he testified that this really did happen, but the desire to maintain control over his life was more important to him than just thanking God, accepting the miracle, and following Jesus.
This is a good bridge to my last question, because when you talk about re-enchantment, it's easy to think about fairy tale, Disney, but in the book you write about Martin Shaw, and he said something like, there is no deliverance without suffering. So in a re-enchanted world, what role does suffering play?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. You know, one of my earlier books is called Live Not by Lies, which is about the experience of the suffering church under Soviet communism and what lessons we have to learn today from them. I remember talking to a Russian Baptist pastor just off of Red Square in 2019. I did an interview with him about how his people had suffered persecution. And he looked at me at the end and said, put his finger out and said, go back to America and tell the church that if you're not prepared to suffer for your faith means nothing. Okay? But he was right. And the point he was trying to make to me is that a faith is only real. You can only know a faith is real if it's tested. On that same trip, I talked to another Russian Orthodox Christian named Viktor Popkov. He told me that, in the early 1970s, he was part of a small group of Christians who would meet in an apartment in Moscow and pray and sing hymns and worship and have fellowship. They knew that the KGB was watching them, but he said, during that time together, the Holy Spirit was so profoundly present that it gave all of us young people who were there the strength to endure whatever came next. Every one of them was sent to prison for their faith. But Viktor Popkov said, once you've had the experience of the living God in the way that we did, you're prepared to suffer anything. And they did. I think that until and unless we're made to suffer, and please God, we never have to suffer anything like the Christians of the Soviet Union did, but everybody suffers, in every way. I'm divorced, and that has been a great cross in my life, but it has brought me so much closer to Christ, and I was telling Father Theodore on the way over here, I don't know where I would be today after my wife filed for divorce and all of the pain that came with that, if not for my faith in Jesus Christ. But it was only when the faith was put to the test that I understood how deep my faith was and how God really is everywhere present and fills all things. I went the day after I got an email. I was living in Budapest when I got an email from my wife saying, I filed for divorce yesterday. I was there on a fellowship. We had never talked about it, and it was a shock. Well, this was the day before Holy Week in 2022, and I was going to spend Orthodox Holy Week in Jerusalem. I got to the Holy City and went straight to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, into the chapel built over Golgotha, went flat on my face and said, Lord, have mercy. It was the most painful week of my life, but God was so viscerally present. I even experienced a couple of what I consider to be small miracles. So those miracles there and the strong presence of God during Holy Week helped me to find the strength to go back to America, to face the destruction of my marriage and my family, knowing that the Lord would not abandon me. The Lord is with us no matter what. So enchantment it's not like sprinkling Disney fairy dust and makes everything okay. In true Christian enchantment is knowing that whatever happens, the Lord is with us. In the same way that for Christians, hope is not the same thing as optimism. Hope is rather, for the Christian, the assurance that God will not abandon us. Even if we are led to martyrdom, if we unite our suffering to Christ, it all has the deepest meaning. And that is enchantment.
Thank you, Rod. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you.
Tankesmien Skaperkraft mulig takket være folkefinansiert støtte fra våre partnere og givere.
Vær med og støtt dette viktige arbeidet. Gi en gave på Vips nummer 10-466, eller enda bedre, bli en partner ved å gå inn på skaperkraft.no. Tusen takk for din gave.